Last month, Americans went to the polls for the first time since Donald Trump took office. Next month, the new Congress they elected will take control of the legislative branch for the 2 years remaining in Trump's presidential term. It is, to say the least, an inflection point in the administration's time in office. To help us understand the significance, we're joined by two observers of U.S. politics, both conservatives, but not quite seeing things the same way. In Stanford, California, Niall Ferguson, senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and author of The Square and the Tower, Networks and Power from the Freemasons to Facebook. And here in our studio, David Frum, former speechwriter for President George W. Bush, now staff writer at The Atlantic magazine, and author most recently of Trumpocracy, The Corruption of the American Republic. And I'm delighted to welcome David, you here, and Neil in California, back to our station. We had both you gentlemen on for your most recent books, and now we are going to tackle American politics after the midterms. And David, I'll start with you because you just wrote, the midterm elections delivered a less than fully satisfying result for Democratic voters, but an ideal outcome for the Democratic Party. How come?
Well, the Democratic voters were disappointed because many of their heartthrobs did not win. Beto O'Rourke in Texas, Stacey Abrams in Georgia, one was running for Senate, one was running for governor. There are some disappointments for Democrats from the results in Florida. The big headline things in which progressives across the country invested tens of millions of dollars didn't quite make it. But what was a good night for the Democratic Party was that the extraordinary ballot effort they made. You know, the Republicans actually had quite a good night in November.
How do you figure?
Well, in 2000, they picked up altogether, if you count all the votes that were cast for Republican candidates across the country for the House, Republicans in 2018, which was won 4 million more votes than they did in 2010, a landslide year for Republicans. What Democrats can be encouraged about is in the face of this really good performance by Republicans, Democrats actually did that much better and picked up in excess of 60 million votes, which is presidential level voting. So the Democratic Party can say is their voters are enthused, they are committed, they are showing up, and they delivered a big win in the House of Representatives, but a check on the more self-destructive progressive tendencies of the Democratic Party.
Neil, how did you see it?
One of the most interesting things about politics, not only in the United States, but in every democracy, is the way that social media have transformed the game. And one of the things I was asking myself as we went into the midterms was, had the Democrats really learnt the lesson of 2016? In particular, I was curious to know whether the enormous storm that had been over the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh as a Supreme Court justice would have any benefits for Republican candidates, because there seemed at least a possibility that that whole thing had backfired on the Democrats. It kind of did backfire on them in the Senate races. But when you look closely at the House races, the really striking thing was that there was no Kavanaugh payoff for Republican candidates in the most contested districts. And that suggested to me that the Democratic Party, in addition to what David's just said, has also improved its ground game when it comes to social media, because in those contested districts, there was no Kavanaugh effect for Republican candidates.
There was no blue wave, I guess they called it, David. It didn't happen in terms of a massive tumbling of seats, certainly not in the Senate at all, and not as much in the House as it might have been had the Republicans not so successfully gerrymandered so many of the district boundaries. Is that just is that a built-in disadvantage they're just going to have to deal with for the foreseeable future?
Well, there is some of the Democratic disadvantage is inherent. The boundaries of states are fixed. So Democrats pile up these giant majorities in California, and there's no way to share the wealth out from California to outside. But in 2010 and after the census of 2010, Americans redistrict every 10 years immediately after the census. Republicans controlled a lot of state governments, and they did some pretty outrageous things, especially in the states of Wisconsin and North Carolina. And so the Republicans do better, vote for vote, than their Democratic counterparts. That said, the Democratic advantage in total votes cast was so gigantic that it overwhelmed Republican gerrymandering. The Democrats didn't pick up as many seats as they could have in a proportional representation system, but they did well. And about the wave and what is happening, the striking thing that happened, let me give you one district to pay attention to as an example of what happened, and that is the 7th District of Texas. This is a well-to-do area of Houston. an era. So the 7th District is the seat formerly held by George H.W. Bush back in the 60s. It has been Republican continuously from 1966 through 2018. Republicans didn't lose it during Watergate. Republicans didn't lose it during the Iraq War.
It's as red as they come, then.
The Republicans just lost it because there's a new voting coalition. Wherever you have, it used to be wherever you had lots of affluent and educated voters, you had a lot of Republicans. Today, wherever you have a lot of affluent, educated voters, especially women, their Republicans are in danger. And that's what happened in the 7th Texas. The wealthiest district in Houston, one of the wealthiest in Texas, is now a Democratic seat.
Neil, would you agree that when you see things like that happening, and when you see a guy like Ted Cruz, who many people thought was fireproof, winning by only a few points, something's happening out there that Republicans have got to take note of?
Absolutely. The numbers for college-educated women are terrible for the Republican Party. And this is not just a recent phenomenon. There's been a very striking polarization over the last 20 or so years, which has seen college-educated women moving to the left and non-college educated men moving to the right. And this is one of the key findings of the exit polls and other data since the midterms. The other thing to notice is that young voters are abandoning the Republican Party in very substantial numbers. So we have a generation gap as well as an education gap. This is part of the broader story that I think is so fascinating about the United States today, a story of social polarization in a whole range of different dimensions. But there's no question that this is pretty bad news for the Republican Party and pretty discouraging news for anybody who's working on the campaign to get President Trump a second term. Isn't it amazing that we haven't mentioned him until now?
Well, how far did we get in? We're about 5 minutes in, and now you've mentioned him, so I guess that's a good thing.
That is almost a record.
I think you're right. Since we have two such prominent conservatives on our program tonight, we should bring a third into the mix, and I'm talking, of course, about filmmaker Michael Moore. No, he is not actually a prominent conservative, but we do want to hear what he has to say about the prospects for the Democratic Party. So if you would, let's watch the clip, and then we'll come back and chat. If you would, Sheldon.
You can't build a bridge to a racist or a misogynist. You know, they have to be shunned and treated like we treated smokers 20 years ago, 10 years ago. But conservatives, Republicans, whatever, who do care about this country and are not bigots, they're just rightfully angry, we can reach out to them and say, come on, we can create a good, give us a chance. We'll create this good America, and it'll look like the real America. Congress now does look more like that on the Democratic side. And my request to the conservatives who might be watching is to give this a shot. Give these Democrats who just got elected a shot, and we'll get back in the White House and the Senate in 2020, and we will build a country where your houses on fire are going to go into the ocean in a mudslide.
He's almost suggesting that there is a new coalition of progressive Americans that's enough to win. Is there?
No, there's absolutely not. And this is the fool's gold that Democrats face. And this is why I think 2018 was a good election to them. If they had the lucky bounce in Georgia and Florida and Texas, and if they had elected a couple of their progressive headliners, they might have believed, or they might have been willing to swallow that crack cocaine that Michael Moore is recommending. The thing the Democrats need to bear in mind, let's go back to Texas 7th. The reason the Democrats were able to take the seat that had not gone Democrat during Watergate, that had not gone Democrat during the Iraq War, the reason they were able to take it in 2018 is because they first had a brutal primary battle. And the two leading candidates were both women. And one of them was a Michael Moore type Democrat, progressive, full, Medicare for all, $15 minimum wage. And the other was a woman whose family were prominent local business owners, and she was a partner in a prominent law firm. She'd been active in civic affairs.
Moderate Democrat.
A business-oriented Democrat.
Okay.
Maybe not we don't call them conservatives anymore, but someone who's very aware of economic realities. And because the business-oriented Democrat won, the seat went Democratic. Had the Michael Moore type Democrat won, then the Republican incumbent, who's a really good candidate, and not a Trumpy person, he was a good, and not someone who made wild noises, his name was Culberson, good constituency congressman, took care of people, made sure that his district's needs were met, he would have been able to see off a progressive challenge. So what the challenge for Democrats is to understand is there is an anti-Trump majority, potent in potential, and it's powerful. It is certainly not a conservative majority, but it is not progressive. And let me say, here has been to date one of the asymmetries of the parties. About a third of America is right, and about a fifth of America is left, whatever those two terms mean in the modern age. When you're a third, it's easy to delude yourself that 51% is just in reach. If you're 20%, you have to have the realism to understand 51% is not within reach. You have to work with others.
So does that suggest then, Neil, that if the Democrats, Ed Rogers of the Washington Post cautioned the Democrats, don't quote unquote go crazy and pick a bunch of far left candidates just to make you feel good, because that's not how you're going to get to win. Is David right in as much as it's got to be more centrist Democrats that are the ticket to victory in the future?
Without question, the only real hope for Donald Trump in 2020 is going to be to run against a candidate who personifies progressivism. If they were to nominate somebody on the left of the party, then I think he might just have a shot. If they nominate a centrist candidate, then it's hard to see how he makes it to a second term. I would want to add one thing, though, to Michael Moore's observations. I live in California. It's easy to forget that there's a Republican administration in Washington, because this is essentially now a one-party state. And it must be said that if your concern is environmental issues, wildfires, or for that matter, inequality and the problem of poverty, the Democratic record in California at this point is so terrible that they need to be extremely careful, because the message, let's turn the whole of the United States into California, is not a particularly enticing one for the kind of voters who are the key. And the voters who were the key in 2016 were those voters in places like Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania who'd voted for Barack Obama and then turned around and voted for Donald Trump. Those people are not going to vote for Elizabeth Warren, or for that matter, Kamala Harris. So there are a whole bunch of candidates that the Democrats could nominate who I think could lose to Trump. It's well within the powers of the Democratic Party to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory.
In which case, David, who should we take off the list right away? You heard two names mentioned. Who else?
I think that the Democrats need to think. They have a puzzle to put together. And it begins by thinking more carefully about what you mean by the term left. Because there are two lefts in the Democratic Party. There is the urban progressive left, the kind of people who did turn out for Bernie Sanders. And that urban progressive left is younger, and it is non-black. It's not white anymore. It's multi-ethnic, but it is very much not an African-American voting group. And then you have a left which is black Americans who are the most loyal Democrats, most committed and most organized. Black Americans came out in huge numbers for Barack Obama in 2008, and then in heroic numbers for Barack Obama in 2012. In fact, the reason Mitt Romney thought he was going to win the election in 2012 was he could see in his polls that Barack Obama's support among all other groups was declining. And he believed that the performance that Democrats had got from black Americans in 2008 was about as much in terms of voter turnout. They got about as many people to the polls. It was an historic record in 2008. And you don't expect to, having broken a record one year, to break it again 4 years later. But indeed, black turnout in 2012 was even higher than it was. In fact, 2012 was the only election in American history where blacks were more likely to show up at the polls than whites were. And that's what saved Obama, was that this extraordinary performance. And it concentrated among older people and women. Now, that what happened in 2016 was that black voter turnout just collapsed. Back, no, not to 2008 levels, but back even below that.
They didn't come out for Hillary.
They didn't come out for Hillary Clinton. And that's partly because of voter suppression and things like that. But they came out in 2018. Here's the problem. Democrats talk about these two groups as if they're the same, as if they're both the left. But they actually are quite different. They have different interests. And they don't tend to like the same candidates. So a candidate like Bernie Sanders, who was very exciting to the urban progressive non-black left, was anathema. Bernie Sanders had gender and racial gaps that are more reminiscent of Donald Trump than of any Democratic candidate. So the Democrats have to find a candidate who can, without frightening away the moderate, suburban, college-educated women they need, that can keep at peace both this progressive left and the black regulars. And that doesn't sound to me like Kamala Harris. That sounds to me like, well, we can talk a little. I've given a long enough answer, but that sounds to me like you need to have someone who's more in tune with the interests of African American voters than with the Panera voter.
Okay, yeah, Neil, if you accept David's premise going into all that, and it's not Kamala Harris and it's not Elizabeth Warren, two senators who you feel are too far to the left of the Democratic Party, you want to put some names on the table you think it could be?
Well, I actually think they're very likely to nominate Kamala Harris. California is now enormously powerful in the Democratic Party, and she's going to be a very appealing candidate to the party base at this time, a woman and a woman of color. And I sense that is going to be a very attractive proposition. She's also a formidable politician, and she has strong backing from Silicon Valley. So I've already made the suggestion in public that she will be the nominee. Of course, to make any suggestion like that at this early stage in the game is complete madness, and I'm bound to be wrong. What I struggle to imagine is Beto O'Rourke, who lost against Ted Cruz in Texas, riding to the rescue. He's the darling of many liberal journalists who have a kind of man crush on him if they're male, or just a plain old crush if they're female. And I'm struggling to picture that scenario. But you know, David, I noticed you pull back there from naming a name. You're far too wise to commit yourself at this early stage. But maybe you can help me out. Does somebody who lost a Senate race actually have a shot at being a presidential nominee?
Worked for Abraham Lincoln.
I was not being bashful. I just was conscious of the time. Yes, well, the supporters of Beto O'Rourke point out that Abraham Lincoln lost the Senate in 1858 and then won the presidency in 1860, and that did indeed happen. Would you like the list of people who lost a Senate seat and then didn't go on to be president? It numbers in the hundreds.
Start with John McCain and keep going backwards.
Yeah. Losing once is usually a good prelude to losing a second time. I don't think they will do this, but here I think their smartest pick for the ballot, for the top of the ballot in 2020 is Sherrod Brown, who's a senator from Ohio.
You think he's the best pick to beat Trump?
Yes. Here's why. First, he has a proven record of doing well with black voters. And this is absolutely indispensable. Democrats have to not just win them, but mobilize them, make them care in a way that Hillary Clinton was never able to do. Sherrod Brown is a little bit more on the liberal side on a lot of economic issues. He's a union-oriented guy, but he's not a favorite of Silicon Valley. He's not a favorite of Wall Street. And
he's a blue-collar guy.
Yeah, well,
from a blue-collar state.
Let's not get carried away about this. He is a Yale graduate. I mean, he is he
doesn't come off as
one. But he has a blue-collar affect.
Yeah.
But he is not what he is. He is someone who will keep them focused on bread and butter issues, and basically, I would say that given that the Democrats have there are four pieces they have to keep together. I mentioned before, black regulars, the urban progressive left, the suburbs, and then a small number of down-market whites, especially women. And I would say that when you're thinking about this, the Democrats, if they were smart, would think about those four pieces, and in order of keeping them happy. They are, number one, black Americans. You have to have them be happy. Number two is at that point the suburban moderates. And only then do you start worrying about the urban progressive left, and because you're not going to do very well with them the down market white women, the waitress moms who were important during the Clinton years. And so whenever you see a Beto O'Rourke or whenever anybody's, I like the Pod Save America podcast as much as the next person. I enjoy it. But if they get enthusiastic about somebody, that is a prominent negative indicator, because that tells you that is absolutely the urban progressive non-black left, and that this person is probably not going to appeal to the black regulars and to the suburban moderates.
Okay. David, have you ever had a chance to meet Steve Bannon?
From time to time.
Yeah, I think you have.
Yeah.
There was a pretty interesting debate that took place at Thompson Hall in downtown Toronto not too long ago. I think you might have been there. I think he might have been there. Shall we show a little snippet of it?
Sure.
Let's do it. Sheldon, if you would, please.
We're at the beginning of a new political revolution, and that is populism. The only question before us, is it going to be a populist nationalism that believes in capitalism and deconstructing the administrative state and giving the little guy a piece of the action and break up this crony capitalism of big corporations and big government? Or is it going to be a Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders type of populist socialism?
Let me get both of you on this. Neil, to you first. Are left and right-wing populisms really the only available options going forward, as Steve Bannon has suggested?
Well, I think they are for a couple of reasons. One is historical. It's just that in the wake of major financial crises, there have generally been two options available, the populism of the left or the populism of the right, and the populism of the right has tended to do better over the last century and a half, for which we have good electoral data. The other reason has to do with the impact of social media, something I talked a lot about in The Square and the Tower. Once you have a public sphere dominated by platforms such as Facebook and Twitter or YouTube, it's very hard for the centrist, for the person in the middle of the political spectrum to get airtime, because the way these platforms operate essentially encourages not just fake news, but extreme views. And the data are very clear on this. It's actually much easier to get retweeted. Maybe you've noticed this, David, if you use emotive language in your tweet than if you present the facts in a sober way. So the structure of modern democracy, because of the rapid rise of network platforms, favors populists. The other point that is worth adding is that there seems to be a relatively short half-life. I've argued in the past that populism of either brand, left or right, only has about 2 years before voters go, oh, the heck with that. But what do they do when they become disillusioned with the first flavor of populism? The answer is that they try the other flavor. And that happened in Britain. You can tell from my funny accent, that's where I originate from, though I'm now an American citizen. In fact, we have two immigrants here discussing American politics as if they've been born there. But my big observation from Britain is that Brexit, after a relatively short time, started to kind of lose its appeal and become bogged down in the technicalities of European divorce law, at which point, of course, Jeremy Corbyn, the most left-wing leader the Labour Party has ever had, and a populist of the left, if ever there was one, suddenly sprang to the forefront, particularly amongst younger voters. And I wouldn't be at all surprised to see the pendulum perform a similar swing in the United States.
You were on that stage with Steve Bannon when he made that suggestion that there are only two future options out there. What did you think when he said it?
I said, if I want to suggest to you that you should eat glue, you say, I'm not going to eat glue. Glue is disgusting. Well, what if the only alternative to eating glue is having nails driven through your feet? I say, well, in that case, I might eat glue. But you know, I don't believe you. I think there are other choices in life than either eating glue or having nails driven through your feet. So it's a completely false choice. And indeed, I think we are going to see the pendulum swing back, and I think in many places we are seeing it swing back to more responsible politics for this reason. What enabled the populist movements of the past decade are a series of elite-driven policy decisions that didn't work out so well, to put it mildly. The Iraq War, the securitization of mortgage debt, which led to the financial crisis, and the single euro currency for the European continent. All of these ideas turned out to be calamitous for the people.
Is the jury out on the last one?
I think the jury has returned on the euro, and yeah, the euro is the reason why all of Europe, except for Germany, is and the German suburbs in Austria and the Netherlands and Belgium, is in profound economic crisis, because what the euro did was it subsidized Germany to export and subsidized everybody else to borrow. So the elites had their brainwaves, and that were, all the nicest people recommended them, and they didn't work out, and voters then reacted by choosing adopting a series of irresponsible alternatives. The Trump campaign in the United States, this crazy new coalition in Italy, which is an anti-euro currency coalition, the National Front in France, and Neil will have different views, but the Brexit adventure. It is now at the end of 2018 pretty visible that the North American economy is sliding to recession, the British economy is moving into crisis, that Italy is heading toward a debt crisis, and the populist recommendations are about to deliver their own dose of pain. And it's going to turn out that eating glue makes you very, very sick. And the people who are made sick by eating all of that glue are going to turn around and say, well, I'm still not crazy about the nail driving through feet alternative. Does anybody else have any other ideas? And so, well, what if we just refrain from eating glue? What if we start with not eating glue? Is that possible?
Steve,
it's very possible.
Disagree.
Come on in, Neil.
Well, it's just that what David's just said, with all due respect, implies that the elites are somehow going to come to their senses and say, well, we better not do any more foreign policy adventures. We'll stop securitizing mortgages and we'll break up the euro. But none of that, of course, is going to happen. And that's why I don't buy the notion that the pendulum is going to find a happy medium in the middle of the political spectrum. Actually, look around the world and see any sign, if you can, of the political centre getting stronger. Can I point out that Emmanuel Macron, the French president, who was supposed to ride to the rescue of the political centre last year, is the most unpopular leader to appear at the G20 and is returning from Buenos Aires to full-blown riots in the streets of Paris. There's a problem with your thesis, David, and that is that it's not happening. I've just been down in South America to Brazil, where the newly elected president, who's about to be inaugurated, Jair Bolsonaro, really makes Donald Trump seem like a liberal on a range of issues, and needless to say, is Steve Bannon's new pin-up. So if there's going to be a resuscitation of the political centre, I'm struggling to see where it's happening.
Well, it happened first and foremost in the 2018 American midterms, where, as I said, the left did not elect its candidates, but where suburban moderates elected Democratic members of the House who represent the broad spectrum of American business-oriented but conscientious feeling.
What about Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez? Is she the exception to your rule?
She was elected from the Bronx. So that's like one of the most left-leaning districts in America. Okay. There are 435 members of the House of Representatives, and many of them are going to represent very outlier districts. So if I point out to you that there's someone from deepest Mississippi who flies the Confederate flag in his congressional office, that doesn't mean that the Confederacy is about to resweep the United States. And the fact that you have from the Bronx, from this deeply, deeply Democratic area, a very left-wing candidate, that's not a surprise. I think what's more telling is the case of the suburban districts in Houston and other suburban districts across the country, where the Democrats have shrewdly recognized that Ocasio-Cortez may play in the Bronx, but she doesn't play in suburban Colorado Springs, she doesn't play in suburban Houston, and they avoided those. And the leadership of the new Democratic leadership in Congress looks, I think, pretty responsible. So we'll see. There'll be questions. I think all these things happen with a bit of a lag. I mean, Britain is definitely in a where they don't have, there's no Blairite alternative for Britain. There's no Cameron alternative for Britain. It's either the Brexit adventure or it's Jeremy Corbyn. Theresa May is looking for a third way, an escape from this, but she doesn't have the nimbleness to execute it. I'm tempted to let you and our British American friend, go on about Brexit, but with time running out, I want to get us onto something that I think is well, I'm hearing a lot of chatter about this now. Joe Scarborough says it on his morning television program. Jeffrey Toobin, Neil said it on CNN recently, that he doesn't think Donald Trump is going to finish his term. This is coming out more and more. Now, it may be wishful thinking for a lot of people, Neil, but do you think there's any possibility of that happening?
Of course, there's a possibility that there are all kinds of ways in which a president's term can be terminated. The president's diet itself, not to mention his Scottish DNA, gives, I think, cause for concern in its own right. But if the implication is that there's going to be a successful impeachment, if the implication is that we're somehow going to rerun Watergate with Donald Trump in the role of Richard Nixon, that doesn't persuade me, because I see no scenario in which the Senate, under Mitch McConnell's leadership, decides to throw Donald Trump under the bus. Particularly because I think if the Republicans were to abandon Trump, they would lose a substantial proportion of their electorate for the rest of time, or at least for a very, very long time. Because you have to remember that however bad things go, and they're going to go very badly indeed next year, there's a very solid core of voters who are going to be loyal to Donald Trump pretty much regardless. And that's the key reason why I see him getting to the end of the first term, absent any health issue. The idea of his getting re-elected, though, I think that's becoming less and less plausible, simply because 2019 is going to be dominated not just by the findings of Robert Mueller, the special counsel, but now also by the investigations of a whole bunch of congressional committees, now to be chaired by Democrats, who will use their subpoena powers to cause maximum embarrassment to the president and those close to him. And that's going to dominate the news cycle next year to the exclusion of almost everything else. And it's bound to wear away at Trump's support until finally only that base is left, a base that simply isn't sufficient to secure a second term. Something really remarkable will have to turn up to avoid that. One little point to add, I'm not sure I agree with you, David, that the US economy is sliding into recession. There's no evidence of that in the data at this point. In fact, the US economy is still doing remarkably well, which is why the Federal Reserve is going to keep tightening rates. It might be by the time we get to 2020 that it's really no longer plausible to say that it's a super strong economy, but a recession still seems to me to be still quite a low probability event, and certainly not something I expect imminently.
David, on the issue of Trump not finishing his first term?
Well, as Neil said, the health issues, of course, are very real. We have gotten used to presidents living a very, very long time. Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, they all lived to great ages. But that doesn't always happen, and Donald Trump is certainly a candidate for health troubles. Barring those, however, I don't see an impeachment outcome as all that likely. As we have discovered from both the Nixon and the Clinton experiences, a president is not in serious danger of an impeachment and a removal unless both parties think he needs to go. And that has not happened. And as we saw from the very first impeachment event in American history, Andrew Johnson, after the Civil War, when a president has a strong base of support, no matter how small, that impeachment events really do threaten violence. Andrew Johnson was the president immediately after the Civil War. He had a lot of support from the traditional South. The North was horrified by his impeachment, by his Reconstruction policies. There was an attempt to remove him, and violence really did loom as a possibility until the project was given up. But I think the Democrats are going to want to keep Donald Trump on the scene to run against him. Here are the reasons I think that I think there are lots of signs the economy is heading into trouble. The financial markets have been signaling it. October of 2018 was the worst month in financial markets since 2008, 2009. At the beginning of December, the yield curve, the shape of the bond curve that indicates the expectations of market players, went inverted. That indicates a sense that that's a traditional harbinger of economic trouble ahead. These trade wars that Trump keeps waging are not pro-growth. So you just sense, and you see one other thing. Well, consumer confidence remains pretty high. Business confidence has been declining. So I think there are a lot of indications. I'm not predicting some cataclysmic, apocalyptic economic event, but Donald Trump is going to be running at the end of 2019 and 2020 in a non-incumbent favorable economic environment.
You're sure he's running again?
I think his mental imperatives will make it very difficult for him to acknowledge bad news. So even if the numbers are all there, we saw this happen in 2018, that what a normal president would have done is looked at the polls for 2018 and said, my party is probably going to do pretty badly. And so the strategy is, one, the president absents himself as much as possible. So you remove the target.
He doubled down.
You also give yourself some deniability later that they didn't vote against me. And then you free your candidates to run the most local possible race. Instead, he nationalized the race, which is not something you do when you're unpopular, because he needed to. It was not a strategic decision, it was an emotional one. And I think his decisions about 2020 will likewise not be strategic, they'll be emotional.
You mentioned the Civil War in the midst of that answer, and I want to put that to Neil, because your colleague at the Hoover Institution, Victor David Hanson, says the U.S. finds itself, quote, at the brink of a veritable civil war. That was his line. What's your read on his take on things?
Well, I have the greatest respect for Victor Davis Hanson. He's a great historian. And I also take this question seriously. Ever since Charles Murray published his brilliant book, Coming Apart, 5 or 6 years ago now, the story of American society has been one of deep and widening division. And certainly on the political extremes of left and right, the language has become extraordinarily violent in recent years. Polarization, of course, goes back a long way, but it's important to realize that it has become worse lately. If you just look at the number of Republicans who say they hate Democrats and vice versa, these are alarmingly high levels. Now, that's not to say that we're about to rerun the Civil War. I think we're very far away from that. At the moment, we have a kind of virtual civil war on social media. It's the culture war. It's particularly active in university campuses where the academic student left has a field day with its extremely polarizing conceptual framework and language. But I don't think, even with all the weapons that circulate in the United States today, we're going to see an actual civil war. So my message, in fact, is a rather different one from Victor's. It's chill, because after all the warnings that we heard following the 2016 election, predictions of American tyranny, if not fascism, the Constitution is working exactly as designed by the Founding Fathers. Donald Trump has been checked and balanced. The midterm elections are an absolutely textbook case of this. And here I do agree with David. But it's a reason, I think, to be relatively relaxed about where we go from here. The most likely scenario, I think, now is that the Democrats will find a candidate capable of beating President Trump in 2020, and American history will carry on remarkably undisturbed by the Trump episode. That's the way I'm thinking about this. Of course, there are scenarios that might produce a more extreme reaction, but this is not 1968. It's actually, in terms of political violence, a much less violent time than the late 60s and early 1970s. And I'm old enough to remember that, as indeed is David. I think that's how we should keep this Civil War idea in perspective, by remembering that most of the war is happening verbally on Facebook and Twitter and not in our streets.
As we put it in perspective, let me read another David to you. David Brooks in the New York Times, and David Frum, I'll get you to comment on what he says. Here's the central challenge of our age, writes David Brooks. Over the next few decades, America will become a majority-minority country. It is hard to think of other major nations down through history that have managed such a transition and still held together. It seems that the Democratic Party is going to lead us through this transition. The Republicans have decided to pretend it's not happening. Trump had a chance to build a pan-ethnic nationalist coalition, but went with white identity politics instead. Republicans have rendered themselves irrelevant to the great generational challenge before us. Is that a potential context for the next either virtual or real civil war?
All right, well, there are a lot of pieces on the table here. So first, Neil is absolutely correct. It is really worth keeping in mind how not violent the United States is today compared to 1968 and 1965, when dozens of people died in riots. How not violent it is compared to 1919, when hundreds of people died in riots. And the riots of 1919 might more aptly be called pogroms, because it was returning whites returning from wars who would see blacks who had taken advantage of the economic opportunities created by the First World War, who launched campaigns in which hundreds of black people were murdered. Never mind the Civil War analogy, in which, of course, 600,000 Americans died in a country of not even 40 million people. The modern world is not a very violent place, and it is especially inhospitable to major organized military operations by big states. We just don't do that anymore. The Russians are demonstrating this in Ukraine. This is the hottest war fought by a major power since the end of World War II. And I mean, it's a terrible thing, and hundreds of people have been killed. But it is not a war that would be it's not a war on the scale that we saw before 1945. We just don't do that anymore. But that said, so I just think that whole analogy and that way of thinking about it is wrong. What is true is that we have, we do have terrible social problems. Mostly they take the form of violence that people are inflicting on themselves. In the past 2 years, more Americans have died of drug overdoses than died during the Vietnam War. Suicide rates are skyrocketing. America has a declining life expectancy. And when you look at who's doing this, it is less educated, less affluent white whites, mostly men, who are being very violent indeed, but not with their neighbor as their target, with themselves as their target.
Because their life as they know it has disappeared.
So what is called for now is a project of social rescue. And the Americans have this problem more intensely than others. The English, not the British generally, but the English in particular have a strong version of it. Canada faces a milder version of this case, but everywhere where you have where you have the touch of globalization, which is to say in every developed country, this is a problem. The minority-majority or the majority-minority situation that David Brooks wrote. Look, diversity is always a difficult thing to manage. Politicians always say diversity is our greatest strength. They wouldn't say it so often if it were true. But it's also, does anyone here remember the year in which the United States ceased to have an Anglo-Saxon majority? It was sometime in the 1920s. No one, now remarks it as an important event. The idea that, it was, when the combined numbers of Croatians and Serbians and Italians and Irish people overtakes the historic Anglo-Saxon, is that going to be a big deal? It turns out it wasn't a big deal. So I think what we're going to discover is the United States has an enduring race problem, which is honoring its never fully vindicated commitment to the descendants of slaves, to bring them fully into American society. For the rest, there are a lot of problems managing it, but it is not the sort of thing out of which major social conflict is made. The major social conflict is this epidemic of self-harm that is sweeping down market white America.
Niall, in just our last minute here, I wonder if I could get you to indulge the nostalgic old fogey that I am by answering the question of whether or not you think America has a chance to return to the more civilized politics that I think it used to have. I know people will say I'm exaggerating how that actually was, but it was better once upon a time. They got a shot at returning to that?
Well, I'm, of course, sharing with many people in the United States fond memories of the late George Herbert Walker Bush. But it's important to remember that as we commemorate his extraordinary achievements, that wasn't quite how he was represented in the mainstream media at the time that he was vice president and then president. I just was reading John Meacham's excellent biography of Bush 41, and there was no shortage of dirty politics back in the 1980s and the early 1990s. So let's not see the past through rose-tinted spectacles. Though one thing's clear, I think if one compares the language of politics, the modes of discourse, the public sphere today with the public sphere of Bush Sr.'s day, which was of course dominated by the terrestrial television networks and the newspapers, that has changed. But you're not going to get the language of politics to become more moderate unless you somehow get rid of or very strictly regulate the likes of Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. And that's really the central argument of the Square and the Tower. The structure of politics has changed. The personality of Trump is not really as important as you might think from the media. What's really important about our time is that the structure of politics has changed in a way that strongly favors extreme views as well as fake news. And I don't see how we're easily going to change that.
Gentlemen, it was really good to have both of you on TVO tonight together, having been here individually numerous times. Niall Ferguson, the Milbank Family Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution in Stanford, California. David Frum, the staff writer at The Atlantic. Keep on keeping on, gentlemen, and let's do this again sometime down the road.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.